So, the overall topic for today is compassion fatigue, which I'll tell you right away does not exist. There's no such thing as compassion fatigue. The phrase does describe something that's very real, but what it describes is not people being tired of being compassionate, it's something else. And I'll come to that.
I was burning out from caring for my husband with cancer. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of compassion fatigue. I've always thought of compassion fatigue as being simply exhausted from caring too much. But Dr. Gabor Mate's definition really hits home. It's not just about being tired, it's about feeling like my energy is being drained by constant resistance. It's like hitting a wall again and again, trying to be compassionate in a world that often feels indifferent or even hostile. It's a heavy weight to carry, and it can be incredibly isolating. I used to think that being compassionate was enough. I'd pour my heart into caring for John, but I'd often find myself feeling more drained than fulfilled.
Here's an article from Canada from yesterday. Poisoning, concussions, why student violence on teachers is a growing fear. And what the article describes is that throughout Saskatchewan and throughout Canada, there's an increasing reports of adolescents attacking, assaulting their teachers. In Britain, recently it was reported that kids in schools, teachers are reporting large-scale polls of teachers in the UK are showing that teachers are seeing more kids who are distracted, unable to concentrate, and to sit still in the classrooms. The number of kids being medicated for ADHD and anxiety and everything else is going up. In the US at least, the number of kids committing suicide is going up. In the United States at least, last year, more Americans died of drug overdoses, more than twice as many Americans died in 1 year of overdoses than had died in the Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghan wars put together. Now the number of people diagnosed with autoimmune conditions, inflammations of the body, is going up. We can assume that these are individual pathologies completely unconnected to each other or to anything else, or we can say, there's something going on here that we need to understand if we're going to address it powerfully and accurately. Now, in my most recent book, The Myth of Normal, the argument I make is that if in a laboratory a scientist was growing organisms in a broth, we call that a culture broth. We talk about culturing organisms. We use the word culture, actually. If in that Petri dish, if in that brew, the organisms were thriving and proliferating properly, we'd call that a healthy culture. If in that same laboratory concoction, the microorganisms were dying or were showing signs of pathology in increasing numbers, we'd call that a toxic culture. Well, human culture is the same. If the organisms in the human culture are showing increasing signs of health, mutuality, inner peace, we'd say that's a healthy culture. But if the number of human beings who are troubled, who are hurting themselves, who are violent towards each other, who are showing signs of pathology of mind and body, or I should say mind-body, because the two can't be separated, then we'd have to say, what is the toxicity in this particular culture? So that's the question that I'm asking. When it comes to compassion fatigue, or what we call compassion fatigue, there are two particular dynamics that we have to look at. One is the nature of the work. What is fatigue, by the way? Fatigue happens when we work too hard. What is work? Work, one way to understand what work is it's energy expended against resistance. So if I push my hand through the air like that, that takes very little work. But if I'm pushing my hand against the wall and there's a lot of resistance, I get fatigued very, very quickly. So part of what we call compassion fatigue is energy expended against resistance. And I'll talk about what that resistance is. So one aspect of what we call compassion fatigue is the nature of the work. The other aspect, of course, is not just the nature of the work, but our relationship to the work. So I'll be talking about two aspects today. One is the nature of the work that you're doing, all of you, whether you're in justice field or education, or you're a therapist, or medical work, whatever, childcare work, the nature of the work itself, and the resistances that you're facing. And then the second aspect is your internal relationship to all that. Because we can relate to whatever is happening, either consciously or unconsciously. And the more conscious our response is, the more effective it is, and the more sparing of our own energies. The more unconscious our response is, the more likely we are to get burnt out. So I'll be talking about both aspects. But as I stretched my hand here, I noticed, I was reminded of what I'm wearing here. Let me make a peripheral comment, but it's related. It's related. I think Suzanne was talking about the response to refugees and how defensive the European countries, including the UK, is becoming around the issue of refugees. Well, we can understand that a refugee problem is coming from the outside as a threat to us, or we can put it into historical context, into the context of relationship, including what is the relationship of our particular societies to those refugees that are coming to our shores now. You don't have to agree with me on this one, but I just can't let this one go. And the reason I can't let it go, because I'm so close to it myself. For one thing, I was a refugee myself coming to Canada in 1956 after the Hungarian Revolution. For another, 3 weeks ago, I was up in a place called Haida Gwaii. When Ray and I visited the museum here, we saw a beautiful totem pole from Haida Gwaii, which are islands in northern British Columbia. And we said to each other, what the hell is it doing here? And it's going to be given back. It's going to be sent back. But it was looted from the people of Haida Gwaii by the colonialists. I want you to imagine the person who, it used to be known as Haida Gwaii, then it became Queen Charlotte Islands. So all of a sudden the people of the land who lived there for 13,000 years, all of a sudden we're living in a place called Queen Charlotte Islands. I want you to imagine what it would be like, the chief of Haida Gwaii, the people there, who effected the reversal of the name from Queen Charlotte Islands to Haida Gwaii. When I was growing up, it was Queen Charlotte Islands. More recently, it reverted to its original Aboriginal indigenous name of Haida Gwaii, which means land of the people. The chief who effected that transition is Chief Gujau, with whom I had the privilege of having dinner 3 weeks ago. I want you to imagine what it would be like if the Haida people landed here in what are called the British Isles, in the United Kingdom, And all of a sudden, these islands were called Chief Gujaw Islands. Then I want you to further imagine if your children went to school and they spoke either Gaelic or English, they'd be beaten up by their teachers. They'd have a pin stuck through their tongue if they spoke their native language. I had an 80-year-old woman, almost 80-year-old woman, come up on the second day of this workshop. And she says, Stan, I want you to help me, in front of 100 people, of her people. I said, what's the problem? She said, I've forgotten my language. She spoke perfectly good Haida until she was 5 years old, and then she forgot it. And not only did she forget it, even later on when she went to language school to regain her mother tongue, the words don't stick in her brain. And there's nothing intellectually or cognitively wrong with her. You know what happened? When she was 5 years old, she went to school. She had to go to school. These schools that were run by the churches and the state. And she spoke her native tongue. They took a stick and they beat her mercilessly. Age 5. And I said, how did you respond? She said, I said, why me? I was crying, why me? I said, can you say it in Haida? And the words came back to her. And this woman cried out in Haida, I don't know the words. Why me? Why me? And she started shaking. And the shaking that she was exhibiting was exactly the shaking that she experienced as a 5-year-old. And that's not the worst of it. The worst of it was already mentioned on stage here. And Michelle talked about it. The worst of it is that she began to loathe herself. She said, I hate myself. I can't forgive myself. I said, why not? She said, because I was so passive. I was so helpless. I can't forgive myself for being so helpless.
That simple question, why me, echoed through her life, becoming a source of deep pain and confusion. She struggled to understand why she was singled out, why she had to endure such cruelty for simply expressing herself in her native language. This experience planted seeds of self-doubt and a sense of unworthiness that haunted her well into her later years. It's the same question I asked myself. Why me? Why does my husband have to suffer, and why am I faced with the overwhelming responsibility of caring for him? This question, shared across our different experiences, underscores the deep emotional impact that life's hardships can have on us, leaving us searching for meaning and understanding in the midst of pain. Hearing this story struck a chord with me as I navigate the journey of caring for my husband, who is battling cancer. While our circumstances are different, I've found myself asking the same question. Why me? Why us? Why does my husband have to suffer through this terrible illness? And why do I feel so helpless in the face of his pain? The emotional weight of caregiving, much like the woman's long-carried burden, can feel overwhelming, leaving me questioning my strength and resilience. Gabor Mate's retelling of her story reminds me that these feelings of vulnerability and sorrow are part of the human experience. The woman from Haida Gwaii carried her pain for years, but in sharing her story, she also began to heal. I too am learning that it's okay to feel the weight of these emotions, to ask, why me? And to seek understanding and support as I care for my husband. Her story is a powerful reminder that healing begins when we acknowledge our pain and allow ourselves the grace to move through it, one step at a time. Dr. Gabor Mate's insight about conscious and unconscious responses really resonated with me. I realized that I was often reacting to his needs automatically without really being present. It was like running on autopilot, and it was taking a toll on my mental and emotional health. Now, I'm trying to be more mindful and intentional in my responses. It's challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding. When I'm truly present and connected to John, I feel a sense of peace and purpose that I didn't have before. I remember feeling like I was drowning. My husband John had been diagnosed with cancer a few months ago, and it had turned our world upside down. I was his primary caregiver, and I felt like I was constantly on edge, trying to balance his needs with my own. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I was trying my best to be strong for John, but I was starting to feel like I was falling apart. I was irritable, anxious, and overwhelmed. I felt like I couldn't do anything right, and I was starting to resent my role as a caregiver. Then I discovered Dr. Gabor Mate's work on compassion fatigue. I was immediately struck by how much his insights resonated with me.
Now, you know what the reality is? The reality is that her passivity and her helplessness were the wisdom of her organism that saved her life. Imagine what would have happened if she had fought back. She lightened up considerably, and I said, look, go back to class. I think you'll learn now. And I think she will. But the point I'm making about, not only that, then of course, not only did they deprive these people of their language, then they took their culture. That's why the totem pole is here in Glasgow. It doesn't belong here. When it comes to the refugees, where are these people coming from? 3 days ago, I visited Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey is a fantastic mausoleum of history. There are these monuments, statues, eloquent inscriptions to the people that went abroad and oppressed and murdered people all over the world in the name of the empire. Scotland has its own history with the British Empire. It's got its own history both as a subject territory that at times fought very bravely against being suppressed and subjugated, and at times as partners in the colonial enterprise overseas. Both aspects are present here in Scotland, as you know. These refugees, where are they coming from? They're coming from places where climate change has created starvation. They're coming from places where Western intervention has destroyed entire societies and cultures. They're coming from places where during the Iraq War, 500,000 civilians were killed over a lie of weapons of mass destruction. I could go on. And you know what? The book Brave New World, 1984, by George Orwell, you know what it begins with? On the very first pages, if I remember right, there's a scene of refugees dying in the Mediterranean. Do you know how many refugees died in the Mediterranean in the last 10 years? 27,000. Did you know that figure? And if you didn't, how come? Because this society denies what it has done around the world, what it has done to the Haida people. And the Haida people are now having to collect the bones of their ancestors from museums around the world where they were taken as archaeological specimens. And to the Haida people, there's no distinction between the present and the past. The ancestors are with them. And now they're trying to repatriate their ancestors and finding out which families did they belong to, and with what honors and under what signs and with what rituals they should be reburied in their homeland. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying this to blame anybody or to blame anything, but to say it's all interconnected. So these refugees, it's not just a random event. It's an outcome of a relationship. The whole world is interrelated. And we need to look at our role in that, either as recipients or or actors in the universal human drama. Now, as I said, there are two ways of understanding things. One is that individualistic view, whether it's biologically or psychology-based, or the view that it's all interrelated. Now, the idea that things are interconnected is not new. In fact, it's ancient wisdom. But let me tell you something about Scotland. So when I was researching the book, The Myth of Normal, I was looking at the impact of certain social factors on individual health. Now, unemployment causes, the anxiety of unemployment causes inflammation in the body, measurable inflammation in the body. And there was a British study, a UK study, that showed that unemployed people had higher levels of inflammation in their bodies and hence were at higher risk for illness. Now, unemployment is not an individual attribute. It's the function of social conditions in a particular kind of economic structure. So the more unemployment, which is a social factor, the more inflammation in the body, which is an individual biological factor. Are the two unrelated, or is it part of the same process? So I mentioned this British study. Unemployment, it was in Scotland, that part of the UK, where unemployment was most endemic and chronic, where the population showed the highest levels of inflammation. That's how connected everything is. This is a recent study within the last decade or two. So, interconnectivity. So the Buddha talked about what he called the interdependent co-arising of phenomena. This is 2,500 years ago. And he said, contemplate the nature of interconnected co-arising during every moment. So whatever you, always be aware of the interconnection. And the Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, said, it's not that we are, he said, we inter-are. We inter-are. Which has been now proven by modern science, as I'll be showing you. And the Buddha continued, he said, when you look at a leaf or a raindrop, meditate on all the conditions, near and distant, that have contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. Think of that leaf. You can see it as an individual, separate object, or you can see it as a manifestation of the universe, which actually it is, because the leaf contains the sunshine, doesn't it? Photosynthesis would not happen without photon rays from the sun. The leaf would not exist without the sky, the water that falls from the sky, the minerals from the earth. And the leaf might even be affected by human and animal activity. So that leaf contains the whole world, properly seen. But in the West, we don't see properly. We make everything individualistic. He said, the birth and death of any phenomena are connected to the birth and death of all other phenomena. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many, and without the many, there could not be the one. That's what the Buddha said 2,600 years ago now.
As I care for my husband John, who is battling cancer, this idea of interconnectedness resonates deeply with me. Just as the leaf is part of a larger whole, so too are we connected to the world around us and to each other. John's illness doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's affected by his environment, his emotions, and the support he receives. My role as his caregiver is intertwined with his journey, and our shared experience impacts not only us, but also those around us. It reminds me that caring for John is not just about tending to his physical needs, but also about recognizing the broader connections that influence his well-being. It's about understanding that the love, care, and support I provide are part of a larger, interconnected web that sustains us both. By seeing this connection, I'm reminded that I'm not alone in this journey. Just as the leaf is supported by the sky and the earth, I too am supported by the love and strength of those around me. In such a demanding situation, it's easy to forget to be kind to yourself. Remember, you're not just a caregiver, you're a human being who deserves love, care, and understanding. By nurturing your own well-being, you're better equipped to continue your important work and make a positive impact on the world. Just as you've been so dedicated to John, it's essential to extend that same compassion to yourself. Dr. Gabor Mate's discussion of interconnectedness is a real eye-opener. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day challenges of our work and forget about the bigger picture. But when we recognize how our personal experiences, social factors, and environmental influences are all intertwined, it helps us to see compassion fatigue in a new light. It's not just an individual problem. It's a reflection of the broader societal and systemic issues that we're facing. This understanding has given me a renewed sense of hope and motivation. It's not just about overcoming compassion fatigue on a personal level. It's about working towards a more compassionate and just world for everyone. Self-care used to feel like a luxury that I couldn't afford. As a healthcare professional, I felt like I had to be strong for everyone else and that I couldn't afford to take time for myself. But now I realize that self-care is essential for preventing compassion fatigue. It's not about being selfish. It's about recognizing that I can't give to others if I'm running on empty. I've started to incorporate more self-care practices into my routine, like meditation, exercise, and spending time in nature. It's been a gradual process, but I've noticed a significant improvement in my overall well-being. When I take care of myself, I'm better equipped to handle the challenge. Remember, compassion is not about being perfect. It's about recognizing our humanity, acknowledging the suffering of others, and taking action, no matter how small. By cultivating compassion in our own lives, we can inspire others to do the same, creating a ripple effect of kindness and understanding that can transform our world. So let's choose compassion every day. As we conclude this exploration of compassion fatigue, I want to emphasize the importance of self-compassion. In a world that often demands so much of us, it's easy to forget to be kind to ourselves. Remember, you're not just a caregiver, you're a human being who deserves love, care, and understanding. By nurturing your own well-being, you're better equipped to continue your important work and make a positive impact on the world.
So what we see isn't just a function of what's out there. What we see is also a function of how we're seeing. And we now know that the phenomenon observed has a lot to do with who's doing the observing and with what perspective. She writes, "The story of one life cannot be told separately from the story of other lives. Who are we? The question is not simple. What we call the self is part of a larger matrix of relationships and society. Had we been born to a different family, in a different time, to a different world, we would not be the same. All the lives that surround us are in us," she writes, which is just how she is, which is just how it is. Now to go back to Thich Nhat Hanh, and to go back to this really sad incident with that sycamore tree, let's see what Thich Nhat Hanh says about such things. And he died almost 2 years ago now, one of the great lights in the world. And he said, "When you see a child who is well behaved, we may understand that the source and reason for his good behavior is the ground that nurtured him in his community and his family. It is even more important to see the independently co-arising nature of a child who is cruel. Just as with good behavior, the reasons for the child's cruelty can be found in his family, society, school, friends, and ancestors. if we do not shine a light of interdependent interdependent co-arising on the child's character, we get angry or afraid and we blame him. We must do our best to understand his interdependent self-nature in order to understand him, accept and love him, and help him transform. And later on, I'm going to show you a very brief video of a murderer in a Texas prison on death row. And you'll see something I think quite extraordinary about the capacity of human beings for transformation. So, let me first of all give you an overall perspective on human development with this understanding that it's interdependent. The great American psychiatrist and author who you would do so well to invite here sometime, Dr. Dan Siegel. Has Dan Siegel been up here? Not yet? Okay. Dan talks about the what he calls interpersonal neurobiology. And what Dan did as a psychiatrist, like me in my medical training, because of the limitations of modern medical perspective, at some point I had to look beyond what I was being taught to understand what I was observing. And I'll say more about that later. And this happens to quite a few medical doctors, by the way, that we go through a medical training and then, we appreciate the science and the inventiveness and the brilliant achievements of our discipline, but at the same time, we become frustrated by the limited and narrow perspectives that we've been taught. So we start looking beyond it. And that's what happened to me. And that's why I'm standing in front of you now. It happened also to Dan. And then as a psychiatrist, realized that they're dealing with the mind all the time, but there wasn't even a common definition of what the mind even is. So he brought together archaeologists and psychologists and psychiatrists and neuroscientists and historians and sociologists and, did I say psychologists, people from all different disciplines, even quantum physicists, I think, they're trying to understand the mind. And they came to the understanding that the human mind isn't a separate entity. That the individual human mind is actually a manifestation of an interconnected process. And that human minds and human brains affect each other. So right now, whatever state your mind is in, and you just might want to take a notice of it, what state is your mind in? Is it calm? Is it open? Are you upset by some of the things I've said? Are you in agreement? That's a manifestation of the interactivity of my particular mind with your particular mind at this particular moment. And my mind is certainly affected by the fact that there's hundreds of people looking at me wondering what the heck am I going to say next. So it's also all interconnected. So he talks about interpersonal neurobiology, which led me to take that one step further because I'm not a psychiatrist. In fact, you know what? The London Evening Standard had an article about me yesterday, and they said I was a psychiatrist, and I had to call them up and say, look, thank God I'm not, No knock on individual psychiatrists, many of them who do heroic work with deep understanding, but as a discipline, oh boy, they just don't get it. And I don't mean because of individual failure, but because they function as all medicine functions within a certain ideology. I mean, think of the medical disciplines as scientific disciplines. And of course, they do absorb and beautifully utilize a lot of science. But it's also an ideology. An ideology, by definition, is a certain point of view, a certain way of looking at it, things, which includes some things but excludes others. And psychiatry and modern medicine are ideologies as much as they're sciences. An ideology, once you're inside an ideology, you don't realize that you're inside that ideology. You think you're looking at reality, and you're not aware that you're looking at that reality from a certain perspective. And I have to remember, what the heck was I saying before? What was I saying before I started ranting up? Sorry? Oh, Dan Siegel, yeah. Oh, yeah. Right, thank you. I do have an ADD, you know. So when Dan talks about interpersonal neurobiology, as a physician, I take that a step further. Interpersonal neurobiology, interpersonal biology. Not only are our brains wired together, our physiology is wired together. That example I gave of inflammation in the Scottish population due to higher levels of unemployment, that's an example of interpersonal biology. That our biology is actually affected by our relationships. So when Suzanne, in her introductory comments, talked about the necessity of relationship in healing, we also have to understand that the problems themselves that relationships can solve were all created in the first place by relationships. So in 1939, at Harvard University, oh, by the way, let me just riff a bit here on Hungarian doctors, okay? I was born in Hungary. 3 days ago in London, Ray, my wife, and I saw a play called Dr. Semmelweis by starring this great actor, Mark Rylance, who we had the pleasure of meeting afterwards outside a pub across from the theater. And Dr. Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician, one of my heroes growing up. And my heroes were always the contrarians and the rebels, you know, and he was one of them. He was one of them. I mean, one of my favorite movies is Braveheart, you know, and I know that historically it's not entirely accurate, but boy, I wish it was, because I love those rebels, you know. Anyway, Semmelweis was a Hungarian-born physician working in Vienna in the 1840s. And he noticed, and he delivered babies. He was an obstetrician. There were 2 wards in the Vienna hospital, one of the most important hospitals in the world. There was a ward where the babies were delivered by midwives, and another ward where the babies were delivered by physicians. And the death rate from what they called puerperal fever or sepsis, post-birth infections, was much higher on the doctor's ward than on the midwife's ward. For years and years and years this went on. And Semmelweis came to the striking realization that the doctors would be doing autopsies on infected corpses. And then when the woman went into labor, they dash across to the maternity ward and deliver the babies without washing their hands. Now this may seem obvious to us today. It was revolutionary in those days. And this is before Sir Joseph Lister, about 20, 30 years before Lister discovered the germ theory of disease. So Semmelweis hypothesized that there's some kind of matter that's being passed on from these corpses onto these women. But he didn't know what that was. They didn't know what bacteria then. And people said, and So he actually had the doctors wash their hands, and the death rate went down dramatically. And the resistance on the part of the medical profession was vociferous and violent. He was laughed out of the profession. His findings were demeaned. He was attacked. Now, he was a troubled guy. He ended up dying 2 weeks after being committed to a mental health institution. And you know what he died of? They beat him. He suffered a wound. It got infected, and he died of sepsis. In Budapest, 20 years later, 30 years later, his views were totally validated by science and by experience. And thousands of lives were saved. In Budapest, there's a statue, and I grew up looking at that statue. The reason I mention this is because part of the problem that you're facing is the resistance to truth. That resistance to truth is not over. It did not end with the experience of Semmelweis and his subsequent vindication. That whenever there are views that arise that threaten the way things are, you're going to get a pushback. So these days, even though, as Michelle pointed out, the ACE studies and their implications have been fully validated by experience and by science, there's tremendous pushback against the very idea that trauma is any kind of a significant force. The average medical, and I'll tell you later what trauma is, the average medical student does not receive a single lecture on trauma. Not a single lecture, almost anywhere in the world. And yet trauma, I'm going to argue, as science shows, is a major factor in mental health conditions and in most chronic physical health conditions as well. But there's tremendous pushback. When I did my interview with Prince Harry back in March, which was quite the experience itself, the London Times, this is beautiful, beautiful language, they called me overbearing, stern, literal merchant of pain. That's who's standing in front of you right now. 3 months later, 3 months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, The Spectator, another British paper, had an article about the cult of trauma. The cult of trauma that has to be ended before it takes over the mental health field. God forbid. Naturally, they mentioned me as one of its most egregious perpetrators. Addiction, according to this article, had nothing to do with pain. So there's tremendous pushback. And you're facing that pushback. And I know that 4 or 5 years ago, when you had Nadine Burke-Harris here, and then you had me up here, and then you had Fritzi Horstman here from the Compassionate Prison Project, there may have been a certain enthusiasm, and I kind of thought, oh boy, they're going to find out, you know, because you thought that all we have to do, I don't know if you thought this, but there's a tendency, I used to think this, that all we have to do is present the truth to people, and they're going to say, thank you very much. No, they ain't. Because that truth threatens them on a certain level. So part of what you're experiencing as compassion fatigue is just the pushback that you're going to face for the truth that you're trying to express and embody in your work. So that's part of the fatigue. But to go back to Hungarian physicians, in 1939, there was another Hungarian doctor called Soma Weiss, and Soma Weiss, W-E-I-S-S, taught at Harvard. And so honored and revered was he, and is he even now, that to this day, every year, there's a Soma Weiss Research Day at Harvard. where people present new research under the aegis of this commemoration of this highly venerated teacher. And Semmelweis in 1939 gave a lecture to the medical school class at Harvard, in which he said that emotional and psychological and social factors are at least as important in the arising of disease as physiological factors, and they must be at least as important in the healing of them. Now, when he said this, he didn't have a whole lot of science, but he saw what he saw. Now, somehow I said this at Harvard. Every year they honor him with this Semmelweis Day. And 4 or 5 years ago, I was interviewing a psychiatrist at Harvard, one of Harvard's leading psychiatrists, and he said that to this day, to talk about mind-body medicine at Harvard is to jeopardize your career. And Weiss's article, by the way, was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1940. So 80 years after he said this, his views, he is venerated and his views are totally disregarded. That's the state of the profession. That's what Michelle was talking about in relationship to her own physician. In 1977, there was an American physician and a psychiatrist called George Engel who said that our view of health is really inadequate because we separate the mind from the body. By the way, you know who the first person was to criticize doctors for separating the mind from the body? It was Socrates, 2,500 years ago, who said that the problem with the doctors of today is they separate the mind from the body. They don't see the whole. So this is endemic in Western culture. And George Engel called for what he termed a biopsychosocial approach, which understands that human biology is inseparable from psychology and from people's social conditions, which I've already given you one example of. And what tends to happen, you'd think that when people come up with these great insights, the reception will be enthusiastic and they would transform. But the system has got its own ideology, it's got its own purposes, it's got its own intentions. And it's almost impenetrable. And again, it's going to continue that way for a long time. So in considering your own work, to the extent that you align with a view of reality that Suzanne talked about, that Michelle talked about, and that I'm trying to convey here, to the extent that you align with it, expect resistance. Expect that it's not going to be appreciated necessarily or even understood. And that really magnifies the difficulties that you're facing. Because not only are you dealing with a traumatized population, and everybody you deal with is traumatized, otherwise you wouldn't have to be dealing with them. Pretty much. All the troubled kids, all the mentally ill people, or so-called mentally ill people, all the people who are acting in ways that are harmful to themselves or to other people, they're all traumatized. And so not only are you having to deal with people that are very troubled in themselves, but you're also having to do so to one degree or another in institutions and organizations and in a larger culture that's not very open and perhaps even resentful of the way you see things. And that's very difficult. So, and that's not going to change overnight. Which is not to say that you should be discouraged or somehow dissuaded from your path, but it does mean that you have to be realistic about the context that you're facing.
The caregiver burden arises not only from the intensive care required, but also from the psychological complexities involved in dealing with someone who is processing traumatic experiences. As the insight describes, the person with PTSD may be sharing their traumatic experiences, but they might also be withholding certain details, either consciously or subconsciously. This partial disclosure can create a challenging situation for caregivers, who must navigate the delicate balance of providing support while respecting boundaries and managing their own emotional responses. Dr. Frank Ochberg, a pioneering figure in trauma studies, reinforces Dr. Gabor Mate's perspectives on the psychological impact of caregiving. Dr. Ochberg emphasizes that the caregiver's exposure to the trauma and symptoms of those they are caring for can vicariously affect them, potentially leading to secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. He supports the idea that understanding the dynamics of trauma is crucial for caregivers to effectively manage their own emotional health. The person suffering from PTSD may undergo significant changes over time, affecting their personality and behavior for weeks, months, or even years. This transformation can make the caregiving experience particularly taxing, as caregivers continuously adjust to the evolving needs and states of the individual they are supporting. According to Dr. Ochberg, recognizing these stressors is essential in developing effective coping strategies that prevent burnout and promote healing. This insight emphasizes the importance of acknowledging and addressing the emotional and psychological impacts on caregivers. It suggests that support systems and coping mechanisms are crucial not only for those directly experiencing PTSD, but also for those around them. Effective strategies might include caregiver education on PTSD, peer support groups, and professional help to manage the emotional demands of caregiving. Dr. Ochberg's work supports Dr. Gabor Mate's call for a deeper understanding of these dynamics, stressing that recognizing the caregiver burden is a critical step in ensuring that caregivers receive the understanding and support they need to maintain their own health and well-being while assisting others.
It's not quite the same as developing his or her PTSD. It's just that you have to take care of this person. This person, in part, is telling you their story. In part, they're hiding the story from you. But for a period of weeks or months or even years, they're not the same. So that's the caregiver burden. And you can see how having a caregiver burden when the person you're caring for has PTSD exposes you to their trauma and to their symptoms. You might end up with a combination of vicarious PTSD and caregiver burden. We use these terms so that people who are experiencing this know, number one, I'm not alone. Number two, it fits into a pattern. Number three, there are remedies for this. Now, the remedies tend to be overlapping too. The important remedy when you go down this path is have some other things in your life. Have sources that sustain you, whether it's exercise or good humor or taking a break or having a support group so that you can share what you're feeling and what you're learning with others. Compassion fatigue can happen to anybody. And the way Charles Figley and the followers of Figley define compassion fatigue, you still have your compassion, but you're tired. You're running out of your resilience. You're on the path toward burnout, but your compassion is there. The way Susan Moeller and others who've written, she wrote the book called Compassion Fatigue, based on her experience as a journalist. It's a different concept. In that case, your compassion has run out. You're no longer compassionate. You're getting hard and cynical and tough and not very pleasant. Now that, to me, is burnout. It's burnout when you no longer have the milk of human kindness. You no longer have the patience to do your job the way you have to do it. It's very, very bad in a police officer, because a burnt-out police officer is in danger of overreacting with violence or of treating the customer, me, the citizen, in a nasty way. You don't want to have a doctor who's burnt out, because they're lacking bedside manner. They may even be lacking the skills that they need to be a good doctor. So I think compassion fatigue, as defined by my colleagues in mental health, means you're sensitive, you're compassionate, you're empathizing with your patient, but it's too much for you. And you're hurting, and it's hard for you to do your work. But you're still salvageable. You've got the milk of human kindness. I don't want to say you have too much. You can never have too much. But you've begun to hurt, and you need help for your pain, while you still have your empathy and your altruism. There's a very different concept, which means that empathy and that altruism has run out. To me, that's burnout, and it's time for you to get out of the helping profession. And if you're a police officer, it's time for somebody in the chain of command to put you on leave and to make sure that you get what you need or you get out of the force.
As was mentioned in the introduction, one of the impacts of trauma is that you lose a sense of your own value. So the more I lack a sense of my own value, the more I want to validate my existence through what I do and who other people and how other people respond to me. A lot of doctors, for all the genuine reasons, humanitarian reasons, that impel them to go into that particular profession, and I should generalize this to people in the helping professions overall, there's often also an element of needing to be important. And I'll talk more about that later. But the result is that then you start to identify with your role and how you see things. You're not going to accept, oh my God, so for 20 years I've been practicing medicine in a certain way, and somebody comes along with a new point of view, and I'm going to say, oh God, thank you, now I understand things better. No, you're going to defend your point of view, because your self-importance is dependent on what you've identified with. So it's a very tough nut to crack. And I don't spend too much of my time worrying about how to do it. I just encourage you as well not to. I mean, if you have a good relationship with certain physicians and you're in a position to have an open-minded conversation, by all means, please do it. But don't beat your head against the wall. Just do your work, demonstrate its value, speak your truth. As a very wise man once said, those that have ears will listen. And those that don't have ears, well, not much you can do about it. Okay? That's my answer, yeah? Okay? Yeah?
Hi. I'm a bit nervous to admit that I'm a medical doctor after...
That's okay.
But I really felt I needed to speak and say, firstly, thank you for coming to Scotland. I'm a bit nervous. And that I
So you
agree.
said you're a medical doctor?
Yes, yes.
How many lectures did you receive on trauma?
I've never received a lecture on trauma.
Yeah, exactly.
And the reason I've learned about trauma is that I've had a very traumatic experience being a doctor.
Yeah.
And I think many, many doctors are traumatized by the experience of going to medical school,
Yeah.
which is, for me, I recognise now, was a traumatic experience. Medicine attracts people who feel they have little value.
Yeah.
And I was encouraged to go to medical school because I was seen as intelligent, and it was a way to please my parents.
Yeah.
And so, and you're right, it is a cult, and I was part of that cult for many years. And I eventually realised it was killing me, and I needed to speak up about things that I saw that I didn't agree with.
Yeah.
And you are right about the pushback that causes. And what I was going to say was, how do we get the other doctors to listen? That was my question. Could I ask how many other doctors of medicine there are in the room? Because I'd love to meet you. Because probably aren't very many. There's another one over there.
Yeah, would the doctors stand up for a moment?
So I wanted you to know that there are doctors that are interested in your work. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not in that field, but I have recently asked for trauma-informed care from my medical... so thank you for speaking.
So thank you, and thank you for identifying yourself and for asking your colleagues to identify themselves, because you need to support each other. It can be a lonely slog, and so you need to support each other. So the more you can communicate, get to know each other, advocate together, the more powerful your work is going to be. So thank you for that.
In summary, compassion fatigue, a term often used to describe the emotional and physical exhaustion experienced by those who help others, is a complex issue with far-reaching implications. While the concept has gained widespread recognition, there is still much to learn about its underlying causes, consequences, and effective coping strategies. Dr. Gabor Mate's holistic approach offers a holistic perspective on compassion fatigue that aligns with his broader teachings on the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit. Mate emphasizes that compassion fatigue is not merely a symptom of burnout, but rather a reflection of deeper underlying issues, including unresolved trauma, societal dysfunction, and a lack of self-care. The role of unresolved trauma. One of Mate's key insights is the significant role of unresolved trauma in contributing to compassion fatigue. When individuals who have experienced trauma are exposed to the suffering of others, it can trigger painful memories and emotions, leading to emotional exhaustion and burnout. Dr. Gabor Mate also highlights the impact of societal dysfunction on compassion fatigue. In a society characterized by inequality, injustice, and a lack of empathy, individuals who are working to address these issues may experience a sense of hopelessness and despair. The importance of self-care. In addition to addressing underlying trauma and societal issues, Dr. Gabor Mate emphasizes the importance of self-care for individuals who are prone to compassion fatigue. This includes practices such as mindfulness, meditation, exercise, and spending time in nature. By prioritizing self-care, individuals can replenish their energy, reduce stress, and enhance their resilience. While Dr. Gabor Mate's perspective offers valuable insights into compassion fatigue, it is important to acknowledge that this complex issue is multifaceted and can manifest in various ways. Further research is needed to explore the diverse experiences of individuals who are affected by compassion fatigue, including those who work in different fields and cultures. Secondary trauma. Compassion. Fatigue is closely related to secondary trauma, which occurs when individuals witness or learn about traumatic events experienced by others. Understanding the impact of secondary trauma can help to prevent and address compassion fatigue. Vicarious traumatization. Vicarious traumatization is another related concept that refers to the psychological impact of working with traumatized individuals. By recognizing the signs of vicarious traumatization, individuals can take steps to protect their own mental health. Collective trauma. In addition to individual trauma, collective trauma can also contribute to compassion fatigue. When communities experience large-scale traumatic events such as natural disasters or acts of violence, the resulting collective suffering can have a profound impact on individuals' mental health. Compassion fatigue is a complex issue with far-reaching implications. By understanding the underlying causes, consequences, and effective coping strategies, individuals can take steps to prevent and address this challenging condition. Dr. Gabor Mate's holistic approach offers valuable insights into the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit, and emphasizes the importance of addressing underlying trauma, societal dysfunction, and self-care. By expanding the conversation and considering additional factors such as secondary trauma, vicarious traumatization, and collective trauma, we can develop a more comprehensive understanding of compassion fatigue and develop effective strategies for prevention and treatment. Imagine a world where compassion is not just a fleeting emotion, but a sustainable way of life. In this episode, we've delved deep into the profound issue of compassion fatigue with the renowned Dr. Gabor Mate. His insights have provided us with a clear understanding of this often misunderstood phenomenon and have equipped us with the tools to address it. Remember, compassion is not about being perfect. It's about recognizing our humanity, acknowledging the suffering of others, and taking action, no matter how small. By cultivating compassion in our own lives, we can inspire others to do the same, creating a ripple effect of kindness and understanding that can transform our world. So let's choose compassion every day. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Inside Serene for more mental fitness content. Together, we can create a more compassionate and fulfilling world for all.